Hey y'all, I hope y'all are doing well today. So my name is Stephen Crotty, and for my country report, I research Venezuela. So as many of you may know, Venezuela is not in a good place at the moment at all, and they've actually become somewhat of a rallying card against socialism that's been used in America, particularly when looking at the 2020 election. So some of my fellow classmates who are really into social media might have noticed that, and might even be persuaded by it. I don't know. But when I'm looking at a country, I always like to look at all the circumstances and all the different arenas of life that are associated, whether that be politics, history, women's rights, religion, etc. Because people make the mistake of assuming that these things are isolated from each other, but they're definitely not. And I hope that me making this video will help explain that for Venezuela and for the rest of the world. Um, so Venezuela has I think, a really cool geography. They have the Andes, which are one of the most um, iconic mountain ranges in the world, and they also have a coastline. Although the coastline isn't particularly safe at the moment, they've been dealing with issues with pirates lately. But the name of the game for Venezuela, particularly, is oil, and it's impossible to look at Venezuela without looking at oil, which has been Venezuela's lifeblood since it was discovered almost 100 years ago. So they can be considered a petrostate, which means that oil is the name of the game for them, and they haven't, even though they say they're a democracy, and they have over the past at times, they have an aristocratic-like system that is not conducive to democracy. So even when things were going well with oil in Venezuela, it wasn't all positive because there were high rates of, there was a lot of embezzlement that was going on in the second half of the 20th century when oil was a good business to be in. But they are beholden to the prices that other countries are willing to pay for their oil. And over the past decade, those prices have just been in an absolute swan dive. And correspondingly, the GDP has too, which makes sense when you consider that oil has at times been almost half of what their GDP is. This situation with the oil isn't made any better by the fact that their political situation is an absolute shambles. There's questions of who even is president. America doesn't even see the guy who is president, Nicolas Maduro, as being president. They actually want Juan Guaido as president, and they actually see him as such. But nevertheless, Maduro is president, and he is not a good guy at all. His family has been accused of exploiting hunger by taking money from families. He's taken money from the country of Venezuela. His agencies have been, such as his police force, have been using practices that are questionable at best, brutal at worst. And then, in addition, Maduro has just ushered in just a huge era of corruption for Venezuela. So the question of how women are doing in Venezuela is kind of an interesting one, actually, because at first glance, when one looks primarily at the CIA fact book, they might see that women are doing well. So based on the data, a majority of women were using birth control, which seems good. More women were able to read than men. Less women or females were dying at birth than guys, and women as a whole actually had a longer life expectancy. In addition, Article 88 of the Venezuelan Constitution is actually pretty unique in that it especially talks about how important women are to Venezuela. But when you look a little deeper, things don't look as great. So I began talking about women by talking about how they are able to use birth control, but recently that doesn't really seem to have been the case because of inflation, which has been another byproduct of oil and Maduro's presidency. So basically, birth control cost than what the a woman who would be working for the least amount allowable would be making total, which is kind of a crazy statistic to think about. In addition, even for women who have left Venezuela, life is not always good once they've left. So, and it's important to note that when talking about Venezuela, you have to acknowledge the vast amounts of migration that is coming out of there because of the horrible conditions. But in Venezuela, but people who are coming from Venezuela in Spain, the Spanish Interior Ministry has seen almost 13 times the amount of abuse that Venezuelan or sexual abuse of Venezuelan women are undergoing, and it's likely this is because they're vulnerable, coming from an impoverished background, and they're just being exploited by people already living in Spain. Lastly, there is still a lot of work to be done to ensure that women can get access to abortion, which is one of the, as the way I see it, one of the key fundamental benchmarks of how progressive a country is and how it regards women. So women, you kind of have to look beyond the bare data, because at first glance, just looking at the data might make it seem like they have it all right, when there remains a lot of work to be done. Religion is really interesting in Venezuela. Venezuela has not been devout in the past, particularly devout, but there has been a boom in religion recently, because it seems that people are using it as an escape to get away from the horrible conditions that they're living in. And then, interestingly enough, the Catholic institution and clergy appear to not support Maduro, and actually, if they do support, it's likely Guaido, which has broad implications for the political arena. So, like I just mentioned, all of these aspects are intertwined with each other. So women are being hurt by the inflation that comes around from the political and economic instability, and then religion could also have a key impact on how the political arena could possibly shape up. So I hope that this goes to show you that you can't isolate different arenas of public life from one another, even though it might be tempting to when researching things and looking into the phenomenon that a country is facing. Thank you. I hope you'll have a great spring break.